Have you ever wondered what happens when prejudice meets its match in the most unexpected way? Picture a quiet stretch of highway under a blistering Georgia sun. A reckless police siren blares, lights flashing as a single patrol car swerves behind an unassuming sedan. In mere moments, the officer's bias emerges, targeting a driver whose only crime seems to be the color of her skin. But justice has a surprise in store. That very woman holds an FBI badge that will spin this entire confrontation upside down. Welcome to a story where bigotry is forced to face the weight of truth and the fallout is explosive. Ebony Lambert clutched the steering wheel of her midnight blue sedan, exhaling gently as she cruised down the quiet highway. She had just left her mother's place in Dovesville, Georgia, a town so small it barely registered on most maps, and was headed back toward Atlanta, where she worked. Outside, the sun scalded the asphalt. Heat shimmered in distant waves across the two-lane road, and the sky overhead was a cloudless canvas of pale blue. Ebony was in no hurry. She'd set her cruise control a few miles per hour under the limit to avoid any unwanted attention. As an African-American woman who had traveled many roads in the South, she knew better than to tempt fate with speeding or sudden lane changes. She reflected on the weekend she'd spent with her mother, Diane, a warm, caring woman who had given Ebony everything she needed to become who she was today, an FBI special agent. Diane always insisted on cooking Ebony's favorite dishes whenever she visited, piling on as much love as she could before Ebony had to return to her life in the city. Ebony treasured these short visits, a reminder of her roots and the values she held close. The small highway cut through farmland and thick patches of pine forest. Ebony's mind drifted to a recent case she'd cracked at the Atlanta field office, a string of armed robberies across major banks. She'd used her wits and unstoppable determination to uncover an inside man at one of the banks, something no one else on the team had suspected. She couldn't help but feel a spark of pride. Yet, in the FBI, there was always another case looming, and her phone rarely stayed silent for long. Her next assignment would no doubt demand every ounce of her skill. Then it happened. A bright flash of red and blue lit up her rearview mirror. The siren's wail pierced the tranquil setting, jolting her heart into a quicker pace. Ebony glanced down at the speedometer. 48 in a 55 zone. She was certain she hadn't made any illegal maneuvers. Still, she eased her car onto the shoulder, questioning if perhaps her brake light was out or some other minor issue had caught an officer's attention. Her nerves danced on edge. Even though she was law enforcement herself and carried a badge that often opened locked doors, she was painfully aware that some uniformed police saw only the color of her skin first. She'd faced humiliating stops in the past, long before she ever joined the FBI. While the majority of officers she'd worked with were professional and respectful, she knew from personal experience that a handful of bad actors could turn a simple traffic stop into something far more sinister. Ebony put the car in park and rolled down her window, heart fluttering but mind focused. She rehearsed the steps she knew by heart. Keep your hands visible, comply with instructions, remain calm, speak politely. She watched in the side mirror as the patrol car pulled up behind her and a tall figure emerged in a crisp, dark uniform. A wave of tension prickled her skin. She couldn't see his face yet, but there was something in his stiff posture that set off alarm bells in her intuition, an intangible hostility that made her muscles tense. "All right, Ebony," she whispered to herself, "just keep calm." She steadied her breathing, grabbed her driver's license from the center console, and waited for the officer to approach. The sun glared off his aviator sunglasses, masking his expression, yet everything in her instincts told her that she was in for an unpleasant encounter. Officer Thomas Walker made his way toward the driver's side window, left hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his sidearm. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a linebacker's build. His brow was set in a tight crease beneath his cap, and the lines around his mouth suggested he was not in a forgiving mood. Ebony offered him a polite nod, ensuring her hands remained on the wheel where he could see them. "Good afternoon, officer," she began calmly. "Is everything all right?" He tilted his head down, peering at her as if she were a suspect in a high-profile criminal case. "License and registration," he barked, ignoring her greeting. Ebony passed her license out the window, then reached into the glove compartment for her registration. She had everything in pristine order, one of the first lessons she'd learned from her father, a retired police sergeant from Atlanta. "Always keep your paperwork organized," he'd once told her. "That way you can't give anyone an excuse to hassle you." Officer Walker snatched the documents without a glance at her. As he scanned them, Ebony took a moment to observe the nameplate on his uniform, Walker. A hollow pang of apprehension jolted through her. She'd heard rumors about an Officer Walker in Dovesville, from local relatives stories of racially motivated stops and an unapologetic attitude. But Ebony had hoped those stories were just exaggerations or outdated rumors. He lifted his face and locked eyes with her. "What's a woman like you doing out here?" he demanded, voice low but laced with contempt. He still hadn't moved his hand from his gun. Ebony fought the urge to bristle at his tone. "I was visiting my mother. She lives in Dovesville." "Aha," he muttered. Then he tapped a finger against her license. "Atlanta address." "Heading back now, are you?" "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice controlled. She wasn't going to give him any reason to escalate. "I'm employed in Atlanta." He leaned forward, lips twisting in a sneer. "Employed doing what?" Ebony paused. She knew some FBI agents preferred to reveal their credentials right away to avoid harassment. But she also understood that sometimes exposing her badge too early could cause complications. She decided to answer truthfully but measuredly. "I work in federal law enforcement." Officer Walker's eyes narrowed as if he didn't believe her. "Federal law enforcement, huh? Why don't you step out of the vehicle for me?" A ripple of alarm passed through Ebony. Yet she was trained in negotiation and calmly asked, "Is there a particular reason you need me to step out, officer?" He scoffed. "Reason? The reason is, I gave you a lawful order. Now out of the car." Ebony took a steadying breath. In her experience, compliance could prevent things from spiraling. She quietly opened the door, unfastened her seatbelt, and slid out. The heat of the late afternoon sun hit her, along with a wave of anxiety. Standing on the dusty roadside, she felt her heart pounding. Officer Walker sized her up, scanning her from head to toe. "Hands behind your back," he said harshly. Her temper flared, but Ebony suppressed it. "Officer, on what grounds? You were swerving. The accusation came out clipped, and you're giving me attitude." Ebony's brow furrowed. She was certain she hadn't swerved. The accusation felt contrived, just a thin veneer to justify intimidation. She made a decision. She didn't want this to escalate further, but if the officer was set on treating her like a criminal, it was time to clarify her position. Gently, she reached into her blazer pocket, keeping her movement slow so he saw exactly what she was doing. She removed a small black leather wallet, flicking it open to reveal her official FBI badge and identification. "Officer Walker," she said, voice steady. "I'm Special Agent Ebony Lambert with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." He froze, eyebrows shooting upward for an instant, though he quickly recovered. "That's not possible," he muttered, eyes flicking from the badge to her face. Ebony cleared her throat. "It's very possible. I carry this badge every day for work." She held it out for his inspection. For a moment, an uneasy silence crackled between them. Walker's cheeks reddened with either embarrassment or anger, maybe both. Then, in a voice less sure than before, he said, "I'll need to check the authenticity of that." "By all means," Ebony replied, meeting his gaze. She had waited long enough for him to reveal his intentions. Now that her FBI credentials were in the open, she hoped he would back down. But as she studied him, she realized he wasn't the type to recant or apologize. Instead, his jaw clenched. She could practically see him searching for a way to keep the upper hand. Ebony braced herself. She knew things might only get more complicated from here. Flashbacks of Ebony's past swam to the surface of her mind. She recalled a time in high school when she'd been followed by a security guard through the aisles of a department store in Atlanta. The guard had demanded to check her bag, suspecting her of shoplifting, even though Ebony was just browsing. Her father, Daniel Lambert, had shown up, badge in hand. He was then a respected officer in the Atlanta PD, and the guard had stammered out a half-hearted apology. Ebony remembered how her father's presence had instantly changed the power dynamic, turning her from suspect into victim of profiling. The memory stung now because, in many ways, history was repeating itself. She saw the same denial, the same resentment in Officer Walker's eyes. "Let's go to my cruiser," he finally said. "I need to run your information." Ebony considered her options. Technically, since she hadn't been placed under arrest, she wasn't required to sit in his vehicle. But refusing might inflame the situation. "I'd prefer to stand right here while you call this in," she said. "I'm not resisting any check, but I also don't feel comfortable getting inside your car." His upper lip curled in a sneer. "I'm not asking, I'm telling." Something in Ebony's chest tightened. This wasn't a normal traffic stop. She was dealing with someone determined to assert power at every turn. She pressed her lips together, meeting his stare without flinching. "Officer, with all due respect, you're pushing beyond standard procedure. My ID is valid. My record is clean. Now, if you want to confirm that, call it into your dispatcher or contact the FBI field office in Atlanta." For a moment, he just glared. Perhaps he was calculating if Ebony would truly give him trouble. The tension between them felt like a taut rubber band stretched to its limit. Finally, he turned away. "Fine," he muttered. "Just stand where I can see you." Relieved at avoiding the cruiser, Ebony complied, standing in the scorching sun. She watched him return to his squad car, presumably to radio dispatch or type in her information. She wondered if he'd even bother with standard protocol, or if he'd concoct some story to justify further harassment. As she waited, her gaze wandered across the farmland, stretching into the distance. Rows of crops swayed in the heat. A broken-down fence ran parallel to the highway, its paint chipped and weathered. She recalled childhood visits to relatives who once owned land here before the big corporate farms had moved in and changed the landscape. In her youth, Dovesville had been small but hopeful. Now it felt like a place stuck in time, clinging to old habits that the world outside had long since condemned. Minutes ticked by. Ebony shifted her weight, her nerves still on edge. She could see Officer Walker hunched over his dashboard computer, occasionally glancing in her direction. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in her chest. Anger, fear, frustration. She'd worked tirelessly to climb the ranks in the bureau. She'd withstood the grueling training at Quantico, proven her intelligence on countless assignments. Yet, despite wearing the same starched suits and carrying the same sidearm as her peers, she still encountered moments like this, where her legitimacy was questioned simply because of her race. At last, Officer Walker emerged, slamming his cruiser door. His jaw muscles flexed beneath his skin. "It appears your story checks out," he said begrudgingly. "So you're a Fed. Congratulations." Ebony raised an eyebrow, refusing to be baited by his sarcasm. "Thank you. Does that mean I'm free to go?" He paused, as if searching for a reason to keep her there. Then, in a voice that dripped with forced politeness, he said, "Yes, you can go." But his eyes burned with a warning. Something told Ebony that he wasn't finished, that perhaps this was just the beginning of a deeper problem. She took her license and registration from his outstretched hand, noticing how tightly he gripped the papers, as if reluctant to let them go. She returned to her car, but before she shut the driver's door, she glanced back at him. "Have a good day, Officer Walker," she said, voice even. He stared at her, cold and silent, until she closed the door. Ebony restarted her engine and pulled back onto the highway. Her heart thudded heavily. She might have been cleared from this traffic stop, but her instincts warned her that Officer Walker would not forget the encounter, and that, for some reason, he would not let it rest. The drive back to Atlanta felt like a journey with ghosts tailing her, each one a memory of racial profiling and tension. Ebony tried to focus on the bright side. She'd walked away safely, but her mind refused to let the encounter go. Something about Officer Walker's demeanor suggested a deeper ugliness lurking beneath the surface. She had witnessed bigotry before, quiet, insidious, and occasionally blatant. And that always had a way of festering into something bigger if unchecked. Once in the city, Ebony steered through Atlanta's more familiar streets, passing landmarks like the bustling Ponce City Market, the Grand Fox Theatre marquee, and the sleek lines of the Mercedes-Benz Stadium glinting in the distance. She headed straight to the local FBI field office. The building, a sturdy structure of reflective glass and concrete, stood near downtown. She parked, feeling a curious mixture of agitation and anticipation. Inside the lobby, Ebony nodded at the security personnel, swiped her credentials, and rode the elevator to the 6th floor. She emerged into a corridor lined with frosted windows bearing the FBI seal, her official home away from home. She navigated past cubicles until she reached her own workspace, which was neat but decorated with small personal touches. A framed family photo of her parents and siblings, a motivational plaque reading "Justice for All," and a potted succulent near her monitor. Dropping her purse on the desk, she sank into her chair. Her phone beeped a text message from her direct supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Monica Harper, requesting an update on Ebony's schedule. Ebony quickly typed back, "I'm in the office. Can we talk?" Something came up. Moments later, she was summoned to Harper's office. Monica Harper was a middle-aged woman with a commanding presence, sharp brown eyes, and curly black hair streaked with silver. Known for her no-nonsense approach, Harper had also been a mentor to Ebony, guiding her through departmental politics and championing her investigations. When Ebony explained the traffic stop, Harper's expression darkened. "He pulled you over for swerving when you were under the speed limit?" she asked, lacing her fingers together on the desk. "That's what he claimed," Ebony replied. "I was definitely not swerving. I've driven that stretch of road hundreds of times." Harper exhaled, leaning back in her seat. "Dovesville, huh? I've heard some not-so-pleasant rumors about the local department. Not exactly a shining beacon of ethical policing." Ebony nodded. "That's what worries me. The officer's name is Thomas Walker. He didn't hide his hostility, even after he ran my credentials. I suspect he has a history." Harper raised an eyebrow. "You think he's likely to retaliate?" "I can't say for sure, but I know the type. He won't like that I had any power in that situation. Worse still, if he's done it to me, he's probably done it to countless others without any ability to push back." Harper tapped a pen against her desk thoughtfully. "If that's the case, we might want to put in a formal complaint. Even if it goes nowhere, it's worth having on record. And if we find evidence that he's harassing civilians, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division could open an investigation." "I was thinking the same," Ebony said. "But I want to gather facts first. I can't just accuse a cop of racism without something concrete to stand on, especially if it ever escalates." Harper nodded, respect in her eyes. "That's prudent. If you need any backup on this, let me know. In the meantime, we're short on hands for that new narcotics ring we're looking into, so I'll need you to pivot to that by tomorrow. Understood?" "Of course," Ebony replied. She left Harper's office feeling marginally better, bolstered by her supervisor's support. Returning to her desk, Ebony opened a file on her computer, a new folder titled Officer Thomas Walker, and began compiling notes from her memory, including her mother's stories and those whispered accounts from distant relatives still residing in Dovesville. She shot an email to a friend in the Atlanta PD to see if they had any intel on him. Ebony was aware that, while the FBI's resources were vast, investigating a local police officer for misconduct could be politically sensitive. She had to tread carefully, ensuring everything was done by the book. Nevertheless, Ebony felt a determined spark ignite within her. She was tired of letting incidents like this slip by without consequence. The vow she had made upon receiving her badge rang in her mind: to protect the Constitution of the United States, to defend the rights of its people, and to uphold the law fairly and impartially. That vow wasn't just about fighting high-level crimes. It was also about protecting people on a small highway in rural Georgia from those who served the law with malice instead of justice. Early the next morning, Ebony decided to pay a visit to someone who might offer more background on Officer Walker, her cousin, Patrice Barnes, a local journalist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a well-known, real newspaper. Patrice had an ear to the ground, always unearthing stories that ranged from city corruption to social justice issues in rural counties. If anyone had leads on Walker's track record, it would be her. They met in a downtown cafe near the FBI office, one that had become popular with local reporters and government workers because of its strong coffee and discreet booths. Patrice was waiting at a corner table, laptop open, curly hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She rose to hug Ebony, concern in her eyes. "What's going on? You sounded tense on the phone," Patrice said, motioning for Ebony to sit. Ebony settled across from her, exhaling. "Got pulled over in Dovesville yesterday. By Thomas Walker." Patrice's expression darkened immediately. "Oh, I've heard about him. He's got quite a reputation." Ebony leaned in, resting her forearms on the table. "I need details. Rumors, complaints, anything." Patrice closed her laptop and folded her hands. "I've heard from a few local residents mostly. Black drivers who say they've been stopped for no clear reason. Some mention intimidation tactics, like being asked to step out of the vehicle, vehicles searched without consent, that sort of thing. That aligns with my experience," Ebony said. "He tried to bully me until I showed him my FBI badge. Then he backed off, but not without an attitude." Patrice frowned. "He's known to push boundaries. I even heard a couple of folks tried to lodge formal complaints, but the local department dismissed them as misunderstandings. I suspect the police chief is covering for him, or maybe they just don't care enough to investigate." Ebony pursed her lips. "If it's happening to multiple people, it might be a pattern. I'm worried he could be escalating. Those who complain get stonewalled, and the cycle continues." "Exactly," Patrice said. "I tried to follow up on a couple of these stories for the paper, but the local station refused to comment, and the victims, mostly farm workers or low-income families, felt too intimidated to push it further." Ebony took a moment, absorbing Patrice's words. "I'm going to try to build a case. If he's violating civil rights, we can bring in the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. But I'll need as much documentation as possible." Patrice's eyes lit with determination. "I can connect you with a few people who approached me. They might be willing to speak off the record. However, be careful, Walker's not one to sit back quietly. I've heard he's got a mean streak." Ebony nodded, heart pounding. "Trust me, I already know. They sipped coffee and strategized." Patrice promised to email Ebony a list of names and phone numbers. Ebony, in turn, would file a preliminary inquiry with her FBI superiors, ensuring any potential investigation would follow the correct protocol. Before they parted ways, Patrice reached across the table and squeezed Ebony's hand. Stay safe, Ebony. I know you're trained and all that, but I've seen how these cases can turn personal. Ebony forced a small smile. I will, and thanks for the help. She left the cafe feeling a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her own unfortunate run-in. It was about people who had neither the badge nor the platform to fight back. Ebony's father had always taught her, if you see injustice, don't just walk away, do something about it. Now she had the chance to do exactly that. Later that day, Ebony returned to the field office, juggling two tasks, the narcotics ring investigation assigned by Harper and her personal inquiry into Walker. She typed up a memo titled, Potential Civil Rights Concern, Officer Thomas Walker, Dovesville PD, laying out preliminary concerns based on her experience and local anecdotes gathered by Patrice. She didn't submit it yet. She wanted more solid evidence. As the hours ticked by, Ebony made phone calls, interviewed potential witnesses, and carefully documented what she learned. Each story shared a common thread. People felt powerless and afraid after being pulled over, threatened or verbally abused. A pattern was emerging, a pattern Ebony recognized from both her personal training on civil rights violations and her own experiences of racial profiling. When she finally headed home that evening, Ebony couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping onto a path lined with pitfalls. Taking on police misconduct cases was always fraught. Small-town politics could be fiercely protective, sometimes even dangerous. But Ebony reminded herself she had the truth on her side and a strong moral compass to guide her. She promised herself she wouldn't quit, no matter how murky the road ahead became. In a modest ranch-style house just outside of Dovesville, a slender woman named Angela Hastings shook as she cradled her phone. The voice on the other end belonged to Ebony Lambert, who had introduced herself as both an FBI agent and someone investigating the possibility of repeated police misconduct. Angela, a single mother of two, had been pulled over by Officer Walker just 2 months ago. Although she'd done nothing wrong, she was merely on her way to pick up her kids. Walker had insisted she was speeding. He'd forced her to exit her vehicle and endure a humiliating interrogation. When she tried to protest, he threatened to arrest her for disturbing the peace. Terrified, Angela had stayed silent and accepted the ticket. Ever since, she'd felt a chill of dread whenever she saw a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. Miss Hastings, Ebony said gently through the phone, I'm so sorry you went through that. I can't promise immediate action, but I need to document your experience. It could be key to stopping this from happening to someone else. Angela's breath was shaky. I filed a complaint with the department, but no one ever got back to me. I've just been too scared to push it. I understand, Ebony replied. I'm gathering information. If we build a strong enough case, we can request a deeper investigation. Your account is important. A pause. Then Angela sighed. All right, I'll talk off the record, but I don't want my name in the papers. Not until I feel safe. I respect that, Ebony assured her. Let's start from the beginning. For nearly half an hour, Ebony listened, taking meticulous notes. Angela's voice quavered as she recounted the stop, the crude language Walker used, how he seemed to relish humiliating her. It echoed Ebony's own encounter. Only Angela didn't have an FBI badge to shield her. After the call ended, Ebony leaned back in her chair, mind swirling with a growing dossier of evidence. She'd spoken to 5 individuals that day, each with a story alarmingly similar to Angela's. While the local department might dismiss one complaint as an isolated incident, Ebony was seeing a consistent pattern of targeted harassment. Ebony started drafting a more comprehensive report. She planned to present it to SAC Harper by the end of the week, requesting permission to open a formal inquiry. The clock read past 7:00 p.m. when her phone buzzed. Her mother, Diane, was calling. Ebony answered, bracing for the usual motherly concern. Ebony, Diane said, voice tinged with worry. I heard from Miss S. Johnson down the street that you got pulled over by the police the other day. Are you okay? Ebony sighed softly, reassuring her mother. Yes, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. I've dealt with worse. Her mother paused, as though selecting her words. I know you can handle yourself, but you're still my daughter, and we both know that some folks don't take kindly to black women who stand up for themselves, especially in uniform. Ebony's throat tightened. I'll be careful, Mum. I promise. They chatted for a few more minutes, Ebony glossing over the details of her investigation. She didn't want to burden Diane with concerns about possible blowback. Her mother had already endured enough worry when Ebony chose a high-risk career. After hanging up, Ebony closed her laptop and gathered her things. A dull headache pressed behind her eyes. She was accustomed to high-pressure cases, but this felt personal. It wasn't a high-profile crime ring or a sophisticated cyber attack. It was a single cop in a small town, using his badge to terrorize people who looked like her. As she left the building, Ebony caught sight of her reflection in the glass door, a poised, professional agent in a tailored suit, hair neatly styled in twists, pinned back at the nape of her neck. Yet behind that polished exterior, she felt the same vulnerability she'd known as a young girl in that department store, unjustly eyed as a suspect. She slipped into her car, the city lights twinkling around her, and steeled herself. If Officer Walker thought he could act with impunity, he was about to learn otherwise. Ebony intended to shine a light into that darkness, and she had no intention of letting it fade without results. Officer Thomas Walker sat in his small living room, the blinds drawn, nursing a tall glass of whiskey. The day had been sour, and his mind churned with images of that uppity FBI agent who dared to pull rank on him. He'd confirmed Ebony Lambert's credentials through a begrudging conversation with his own department's dispatcher. She really was a federal agent, and that left a bitter taste in his mouth. He'd grown up in Dovesville, the son of a local business owner, and had joined the police force fresh out of community college. It hadn't taken long for rumors to swirl that he had strong opinions about keeping people in line, particularly those he deemed outsiders. But Walker saw himself as a defender of the old ways, a righteous guardian in a changing world that made him feel increasingly powerless. Finishing his drink, he set the glass down with a clink. He couldn't shake the gnawing thought that Ebony Lambert might cause him trouble. Maybe she was already sniffing around, trying to dig up dirt. He wasn't naive. He'd grown adept at covering his tracks, making sure official reports matched his version of events. His superiors seemed happy to look the other way, especially since Dovesville was a tight-knit community that didn't appreciate outsiders meddling in local affairs. But a federal agent was different. She could draw attention from bigger places, Washington, D.C., or the FBI offices in Atlanta. That kind of scrutiny might force the department to throw him under the bus, especially if she stirred up too much noise. He scowled, feeling trapped. This was his town. He'd do whatever it took to maintain control. He rose from his recliner and paced through the narrow hallway, stopping at a locked cabinet in a spare room. Unlocking it, he grabbed a file folder stuffed with documents, tickets he'd written, notes he'd made on repeat offenders, pictures of license plates that belonged to people he deemed suspicious. The folder was disorganized, but it served as his personal record of threats in Dovesville. His eyes landed on a photograph of a car he'd pulled over several months ago, an African-American man who had complained vehemently about racial profiling. The man had threatened to sue, but the local department smoothed it over. Walker smirked, recalling how easily that fiasco had been swept away. But Ebony Lambert was a different story, a woman with real power. He thumbed through additional items until he found a slip of paper with Ebony's license plate number scrawled in bold letters. He jotted it down the day he stopped her, surreptitiously. Anger flared again. Who did she think she was, flashing her fancy badge, acting like she owned the place? A siren call of vengeance whispered in his mind. Intimidation, quiet threats, maybe a scare tactic to remind Ebony Lambert that he was no one to mess with. But he also knew going after a federal agent outright was risky. He'd have to be more subtle. Some might have seen the fear in his eyes if they'd been present, but in the isolation of his home, that fear transmuted into simmering resentment. No one had the right to threaten his position in the community he considered his birthright. He tossed the folder back into the cabinet, locking it tight. Then he walked to the kitchen, poured another finger of whiskey, and stared at the moonlit shapes of pine trees just outside his window. "Let's see how this plays out," he muttered. Somewhere, in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he was playing with fire. But Walker silenced it with another swallow of liquor, ignoring the faint quake in his hand and telling himself that he was in control. He always had been and always would be, as far as he was concerned. 2 days later, Ebony found herself in an unexpected meeting at the Dovesville Police Department. She hadn't intended to show up unannounced, but she'd been gathering enough testimonies to feel confident that ignoring this issue was no longer an option. So she drove back down the highway that reminded her too much of that harrowing stop, heart pounding, a steady rhythm. Her official reason for visiting was to follow up on an unrelated FBI matter involving a missing persons case that had a tangential link to the area at least. That's how she justified it on paper. But Ebony also intended to speak with Chief Joseph Williamson, the man in charge of the local force, and, presumably, Officer Walker. The Dovesville Police Department was housed in a drab, single-story building with flaking paint and a weary American flag fluttering on a leaning pole out front. Ebony climbed the concrete steps, her heels echoing against the chipped surface. Inside, the air was stale, and the front desk officer peered at her with wary curiosity. "May I help you?" the officer asked. Ebony produced her credentials, offering a courteous smile. "Special Agent Ebony Lambert, FBI. I'm here to speak with Chief Williamson if he's available." Her presence caused a stir of whispers in the small reception area. Another uniformed officer disappeared down a hallway, presumably to alert the chief. Ebony stood, scanning the space posters about community safety initiatives, a chipped bench for waiting citizens, and a bulletin board displaying wanted posters for petty criminals. Minutes later, she was ushered into a cramped office dominated by a metal desk and stacks of paperwork. Chief Williamson was a pot-bellied man in his late 50s, with thinning grey hair and a forced, genial smile. "Agent Lambert," he said, pushing his chair back. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ebony laid a slim folder on his desk. "Chief, I'm currently looking into a separate matter, a missing persons case that might have a tenuous connection to this jurisdiction. But I also want to discuss a recent encounter I had with one of your officers, Thomas Walker." Williamson's expression flickered, though he kept his tone polite. "Yes," Walker mentioned. "He pulled over an FBI agent, said it was a misunderstanding." Ebony raised an eyebrow. "He claimed I was swerving, which I wasn't. Then he ordered me out of my vehicle and acted in a manner I found unprofessional." Williamson leaned forward, mustering a tired grin. "I do apologize if you were inconvenienced. But let's be real, Agent Lambert. It was probably a simple miscommunication. Walker can be a bit rough around the edges, but he's a good officer." Ebony placed her hands on the arms of her chair, measuring her words. "I've spoken with others who've described troubling interactions. Chief, I want to handle this discreetly, but if Officer Walker has a pattern of targeting certain residents, especially minorities, that's a civil rights issue." The genial facade slipped a notch. Williamson cleared his throat, casting a sidelong glance at the door. "Look, we're a small department. We don't need the FBI breathing down our necks. I can assure you that if Walker's done anything out of line, I'll take care of it." Ebony studied him, noticing the hint of nervousness in his eyes. "I understand local pressures, Chief, but ignoring repeated complaints will only escalate this. I'm prepared to forward my findings to my superiors." Williamson forced another grin, though tension lined his forehead. "Let me look into it. Get a sense of the situation. I'll have a talk with Walker, see if there's a misunderstanding. In the meantime, can we keep this between us?" Ebony paused, sensing the request to sweep things under the rug. "I'm not here to stir up unnecessary trouble, but I do want accountability. I can't promise I'll stay silent if I uncover evidence of ongoing misconduct." He nodded stiffly, the forced smile returning. Of course. Now, about that missing persons case." Ebony laid out a few details. An 18-year-old, last seen heading south from Atlanta, with a rumored link to Dovesville. She didn't have high hopes that the local department would be of much help, but it gave her an official reason for the visit. When she left his office, Ebony sensed she'd done little more than ruffle feathers. The faint tension in Chief Williamson's gaze told her he knew more than he was letting on. Whether he was actively complicit or simply turning a blind eye, Ebony couldn't be sure. As she walked back through the reception area, a figure caught her eye. Officer Walker himself, leaning against a corridor wall, arms crossed. His glare bored into her like a challenge. Ebony met his gaze without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of fear. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Walker offered a sarcastic smirk, shifting his weight. Ebony could almost feel the hostility radiating from him. If she'd harbored any doubts that he would retaliate, they evaporated in that instant. This was a man who despised being cornered, and Ebony had pinned him against a moral wall. She left the station, her pulse throbbing with the certainty that a storm was brewing, and that she had just placed herself squarely in its path. Late that evening, Ebony sat in her apartment, flipping through the channels on her television, trying to find something mindless to distract from the churn of her thoughts. The city lights twinkled through the open curtains, a reminder that she was back in Atlanta, a place that felt more like home than the small town she'd grown up in. But not even the bright urban glow could silence her mental replay of the day's events in Dovesville. A ping sounded from her phone, jolting her. She glanced at the screen to see a text from her FBI colleague and friend. "Agent Ricardo Mendez, heard about your run-in with local PD. Be careful." Ebony typed back quickly, "Thanks for the heads up. Let's talk tomorrow." She flipped off the TV and moved to her desk, where a manila folder lay open, brimming with notes. The missing persons case was real enough, but it also served as the perfect cover to venture into Dovesville without rousing immediate suspicion about her deeper inquiry. Still, she felt uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Walker was plotting his own move. Her phone rang, the caller ID showing an unknown number. She hesitated but answered, half expecting it to be a tip-line call. The voice on the other end was male, distorted as though run through a filter. "You'd best watch yourself, federal girl." Ebony's pulse spiked. "Who is this?" Silence, then a disconnected beep. She lowered the phone, heart pounding. She was no stranger to threats. Investigating gangs, cartels, and high-stakes criminals often came with such baggage. But this felt different, more personal, more local, and that made it more unsettling in its own way. The rational side of her mind told her to document the threat and report it as standard procedure. The emotional side gripped her with a cold dread, the memory of Officer Walker's glare burning in her mind. She grabbed a notepad, scribbled down the approximate time of the call and the exact words spoken. She also copied the unknown number. If it belonged to Walker or one of his associates, the Bureau's forensics might trace it. The next day, Ebony arrived early at the field office. She immediately sought out Agent Mendez, a sharp investigator with a laid-back demeanor that masked an analytical brilliance. He was sipping coffee in the break room, wearing his usual crisp shirt with sleeves rolled up. "Morning," he said, noticing her tense expression. "You look like you've had better nights." Ebony recounted the anonymous call, her conversation with Chief Williamson, and her suspicions about Walker. Mendez listened intently, brown eyes narrowing. "Threatening a federal agent is a serious crime," he commented. "And if Walker is behind it, that means he's not just a bad cop. He's crossing a line that could land him in federal prison." Ebony nodded. "I think we should run a trace on that number, see if it leads anywhere. I'll also let Harper know." Mendez leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You sure you don't want to pass this up to OPR?" he asked, referring to the Office of Professional Responsibility, which handled internal matters. "I will, if it escalates. But right now, I have enough autonomy to investigate. Harper's given me the green light to gather evidence." Mendez set his coffee down and sighed. "Be careful. Racism in a small town can run deep, and cops often protect their own." Ebony managed a grim smile. "I know, but I can't let this slide." They parted ways, and Ebony went straight to her desk to file a report on the threatening phone call. She also emailed the phone number to the Cyber Division, requesting a quick trace. Meanwhile, she updated the file on Officer Walker with every new detail: Angela Hastings's account, the cryptic conversation with Chief Williamson, and now an anonymous threat. A few hours later, Ebony's inbox pinged. "Unregistered burner phone, no direct leads," read the response from the Cyber Division. Disappointing, but not unexpected. If Walker or someone connected to him was behind it, they were at least savvy enough not to use a traceable line. Reclining in her chair, Ebony rubbed her temples. Pressure coiled in her stomach, the sense that time was ticking. She wanted to act swiftly, but a half-baked accusation wouldn't hold water in court. She needed more testimonies, more concrete incidents that established a pattern of discriminatory policing. Determined, she picked up the phone again, intending to call the next potential witness on her list. She refused to let fear or intimidation distract her from exposing the truth. One by one, she would piece together the puzzle. And if Officer Walker tried to interfere with her investigation, well, he was about to discover that Ebony Lambert wasn't just a target. She was a force. Ebony's inquiry accelerated over the next 2 weeks. Each new testimony she gathered painted a more damning portrait of Officer Walker. She found at least 10 documented stops, where drivers of color were cited for questionable offenses. A few were even threatened with arrest for resisting when they questioned him. All of this she meticulously compiled into an official file: statements, times, locations, the nature of each alleged infraction. She also collected notes from Patrice's research, gleaning that local news outlets had once tried to investigate the spike in minor citations but were stonewalled by the Dovesville PD. Over time, it had simply faded from public attention. Yet Ebony knew the next step wouldn't be easy. Filing a formal request for a civil rights investigation meant stepping on the toes of local law enforcement, possibly triggering political backlash. But Ebony had never shied away from doing what was right out of fear of retaliation. She owed it to the people like Angela Hastings, who had suffered in silence for far too long. She arranged a meeting with her supervisor, Sack Harper, in the early afternoon. Sitting across from Harper's desk, Ebony handed over the thick folder. Harper flipped through the pages, her expression growing more grave with each revelation. "Lambert," Harper said, closing the folder, "this is quite a dossier. If even half of this is provable, it's a serious civil rights issue." Ebony took a measured breath. "I'd like the Bureau to open an official investigation into the Dovesville PD, specifically focusing on Officer Walker's conduct." Harper leaned back, studying her with that penetrating gaze Ebony had grown to respect. "You understand this won't be a quiet affair. Once we initiate, there's no going back." The town could circle the wagons. Politics will come into play, I understand. Ebony squared her shoulders. But I can't look the other way. I've got multiple victims, consistent patterns. I also received a direct threat. Harper nodded. All right, I'll submit this up the chain. We'll see how the DOJ wants to proceed. In the meantime, keep your head low and watch your back. I'll assign Mendez to assist you if things get complicated. Ebony felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Thank you, ma'am. The next day, Ebony found an official memo in her email inbox, authorizing her to coordinate with the Civil Rights Division in a preliminary investigation. If they found enough evidence of systematic issues, a formal probe would be launched. She wasted no time traveling back to Dovesville, but this time she was accompanied by Agent Mendez and 2 other agents. Their first stop was the local courthouse, where they filed the necessary paperwork to subpoena records of all traffic stops conducted by Officer Walker over the last 2 years. From there, they visited a half-dozen witnesses, gathering detailed on-the-record statements. The presence of 4 federal agents in town did not go unnoticed. By mid-afternoon, Ebony sensed the tension in the air like static electricity. People peered out of windows, whispers spread. At one point, Ebony observed a patrol car following them at a careful distance, as if monitoring their every move. A crescendo came when Ebony and her colleagues approached the Dovesville PD building to inform Chief Williamson of the subpoenas. They stepped inside, suits crisp, badges on display. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Officers paused mid-conversation, eyes locking on them with a mix of curiosity and hostility. Chief Williamson appeared, his face a tense mask. "Agent Lambert," he greeted. "I hear you're stirring up quite the storm." Ebony offered a professional nod. "We have the authority to review records related to Officer Walker's traffic stops. I'm sure you received the notice." A flicker of annoyance crossed Williamson's face. "Yes, we did. My staff will comply." She handed over official copies of their documentation. "We appreciate your cooperation. By the way, is Officer Walker on duty right now?" Williamson's jaw tightened. "He's out on patrol. Might be best if you coordinate with me instead of ambushing him." Ebony's gaze flicked to Mendez, who remained stoic. She returned her attention to Williamson. "We have certain protocols to follow, but we'll respect your internal chain of command. Once we have the records, we'll review them and follow up with any questions." With that, Ebony and her team turned to leave. In the corridor, Ebony caught sight of Officer Walker rounding the corner. Their eyes locked again, a silent clash of wills. She couldn't read his expression entirely. Anger, certainly, but also a flicker of something that might have been fear. Outside, the afternoon sky hung heavy with storm clouds, as if reflecting the tension saturating the town. Ebony inhaled the muggy air, feeling a curious mix of apprehension and satisfaction. She'd stepped onto the battlefield, and there was no turning back. However the chips fell, Ebony intended to see this through. Because in a just world, a badge was meant to protect and serve, not to oppress. And she was determined to remind everyone in Dovesville of that simple yet profound truth. The storm in Dovesville had only just begun, and the fight for accountability was far from over. But in shining the harsh light of a federal investigation on Officer Walker's abuses, Ebony Lambert made one truth abundantly clear: prejudice with a badge cannot stand unchallenged. Her resolve, backed by the power of the law, set the stage for change in a town that had too long ignored the red flags. And so, we wrap up this story not with finality, but with the hope that justice, once awakened, is an unstoppable force. If you found value in this tale of resilience and courage, please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Together, let's keep the conversation alive. stand against injustice, and champion fairness wherever we see it challenged. Your voice matters, so let it be heard.